This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. What I'm looking at today is 2019's Hellboy, directed by Neil Marshall. And when I initially saw this movie, I fully admit to not liking it very much. Part of the reason for that is because it's a bit of a mess. Though Guillermo Del Toro directed Hellboy and its sequel, Hellboy: The Golden Army, intended to do a third movie. But for whatever reason, Mike Mignola, who is the creator of Hellboy, didn't like what was happening, as I understand it. And so he didn't want to move forward with it. And so this new version of Hellboy always felt like a betrayal to me, in a sense. Though having watched it last night, it is not a terrible movie. As I said, it is a mess. There's a whole section of the movie revolving around the Great Hunt, or something like that. And the thing is, I'm not even sure why it's in the movie. It doesn't make any sense. And as I said, I just watched it. And while the movie doesn't grind to a halt when that scene occurs, it's just confusing. It doesn't advance the plot. It doesn't give us more information about Hellboy. So why not cut that scene entirely? Then there's the scene where we witness Hellboy coming to Earth. This was a scene that was much better done in Guillermo Del Toro's original Hellboy. So to see it done here is also a waste of time. And also, what's interesting about it is that the production design on this movie, in that particular scene, is also not very good. It's better than I can do, but then again, I'm also not a production designer. And so, it looks kind of cheesy and not in a good way. So you could also cut that from the movie. The story, though, with the Blood Witch is really interesting. And I don't care what anyone says about this movie. The third act is magnificent. And it makes me wonder why Neil Marshall has never directed a Hellraiser movie. Because he gets it. He gets Lovecraft. And you can see it in the third act of this movie. It is horrific in a good way. It's uber violent, and it is the best Hellraiser movie that's not a Hellraiser movie that I have seen. It is just magnificent. But unfortunately, it happens in the third act. And everything else before it is not terrible. It's just not that great either. There's just too much of this movie that feels like it was done on the cheap. And that's possible too, by the way. And it just needed someone who really loved the material. And I don't know if Neil Marshall did or didn't, but I don't feel that love on screen, like with Guillermo Del Toro's movies. And Milla Jovovich, I think that's how you pronounce her name. This is probably her best performance I think I've ever seen her do. She just emotes so well in this movie. And it's not something I'm accustomed to seeing from her as an actress. She is typically very one-note, deliberately. She's primarily been the lead in the Resident Evil films, and let's just say I don't think they're the most demanding movies for an actor to star in. So here she really acts. She does evil really well, and it's interesting. And the whole story around the pigman and replacing human children with fairies is interesting. Why not give us more of that story? They did actually explain that, but give us more details. Spend a little more time with it. Let it simmer for a while. This movie is shockingly enjoyable. Is it good? I think that depends on your perspective and how you approach it. If your memories are like mine of Guillermo del Toro's far superior films, then you probably aren't going to like this. But if you've had enough distance between Guillermo del Toro's movies, this version of Hellboy is not terrible. It's not as good as what Guillermo del Toro was doing, but it's not terrible either. And David Harbour is a pretty decent Hellboy, though Harbour's performance is very much like Ron Perlman's. In fact, he even sounds like Ron Perlman. And another thing worth mentioning is that the Hellboy makeup is not particularly good. And in fact, he looks very ugly, facially speaking. It's an odd thing. And I get the feeling a deliberate decision to differentiate it from Ron Perlman's Hellboy. But it just doesn't work. It's just another needless detail. They were rebooting from Guillermo del Toro to Neil Marshall, from Ron Perlman to David Harbour. Let's not pretend that Hellboy is going to be Hellboy at the end of the day. Don't look for little silly distinctions to make him seem different. It just doesn't work. And also what doesn't work is that the Hellboy costume, besides facially being very unattractive, doesn't feel right. It doesn't look great from certain angles, and it looks kind of fake from certain angles as well, which was something I don't think you could say about Ron Perlman's version. David Harbour's Hellboy seems to be wearing a lot more prosthetics than Ron Perlman's Hellboy. His chest, his back, it looks like a big suit at points. I guess that's because it probably is, but it doesn't look good. And while I know Ron Perlman is a big guy, he's not that big, but his Hellboy looked like his body for the most part. Obviously, the horns aren't his, but on the whole, it looked like Ron Perlman. It often doesn't in the case of David Harbour, and it's very weird to me because David Harbour is also not a small guy. And besides, there's also forced perspective, like what was used with the Lord of the Rings movies. So he doesn't necessarily have to even be that big a person to be made to seem larger. There are all sorts of camera tricks and so on that can make that happen. That being said, Hellboy is enjoyable. It was a flop at the box office, which I understand, by the way. As I mentioned already, it came relatively close to Guillermo del Toro's last Hellboy film, Hellboy: The Golden Army, and so I can see people not responding well to this pseudo-reinterpretation. I get it. But the movie is, as I said, enjoyable. It ups the violence quotient considerably from what Del Toro was doing. And while Del Toro's interpretation of Hellboy has a heck of a lot of heart, and that works, this version, not so much. And David Harbour's Hellboy at times comes off a bit whiny, but the somewhat shallower interpretation of the character in and of itself is not a bad thing. Now, I'll also admit, readily so in fact, that I was never a huge reader of the Hellboy comics. So I can't necessarily say that its approach, the 2019 movie, to Hellboy was wrong. I think it was done not terribly well in some ways, and I think that the conflict between Neil Marshall and the producers of the film shows on screen. It is just a somewhat hastily assembled movie. It's overstuffed, overwritten, and could have been a much better movie, frankly. But its greatest problem was simply that Guillermo del Toro's movies came first. If, let's say in another universe or somewhere else in the multiverse, this was the first Hellboy film, I honestly think it would have done significantly better and been much more crowd-pleasing, because it would have been the first film to introduce this character to moviegoers. And the gore combined with some pretty good humor at points. Some of it is a little cringy, but there's also some really good humor. Really would have made all the difference. As it stands, the reboot of Hellboy, and another is coming, by the way, is not a terrible movie, and it's certainly better than I thought it was. So what do you think? This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or follow.